Ladies and gentlemen, President Bill Clinton.
Pretty cool.
Okay. Yeah. Please.
So, when I looked at the set, I thought I was going on Oprah.
Do I look like Oprah?
She doesn't live far from here.
I wish she was here. She'd be great. President Clinton, thank you so much for once again coming. I know you're busy. I know travel is not easy. But you know, one thing I want to start off with, the work you have helped us do, that really wouldn't have been possible without you, I think saved both of our lives. UC Irvine, they were the first academic hospital to implement all of the evidence-based practices that we had put together. And you and I survived some pretty bad stuff, I think, because of that protocolized and loving care they gave us.
Well, first of all, we have people from UC Irvine here. A little over a year ago, I was out here on a foundation event, and I got chills and everything, and I thought, oh, I've had this before. And I took a bunch of Advil and slept an hour and got up and went to this dinner I was supposed to go to, pulled it off. I was fine. Everything was great. The minute the people walked out the door, I started shaking again. And I said, there's something wrong with me. And thank God I was within 10 minutes of the Cal Irvine Hospital. And the doctor, who's the chief of medicine, is here. He said, oh, I know what's the matter with you. I was walking to the door. And he said, you've got sepsis, but you got here in a hurry. You're going to be fine. And I walked out a week later, and in the middle of my, not quite in the middle of a 30-day antibiotic treatment that restored me to something approaching normal life in the sense, to the extent I've ever had one. And, and it was wonderful. So I'm very grateful. And I was a big advocate of patient safety long before that, and work that started when I was in the White House. But it was wonderful to see people who want to know what's wrong with you and what they're supposed to do and not make mistakes doing it. It was great. So I'm applied for a job as their chief spokesperson. and it's, the only good thing about it is I work for free, so it was great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, it's a year of restarts for the Clinton Global Initiative, to Patient Safety Movement Foundation. COVID just unfortunately just left us in a moment that we couldn't get together, we couldn't do any of this. I've always thought CGI was one of the greatest humanitarian movements I'd ever seen. It was your movement that inspired me to do this. We're trying to get momentum again. I came to CGI, and I thought it was fantastic. It was right where we left off. And I think to a certain extent, I feel like this is right back where we left off. But what advice could you give us as you try to restart CGI for us to get the momentum back for patient safety movement?
I think it's only slightly different what our needs are. But one of the biggest problems you have in any big, complicated society is that almost everybody has solved almost every problem everywhere. And yet there is an incredibly built-in resistance to being the second or third or fourth or 100th person who does the same thing. It's proven to work, which is exactly the reverse of what we should be doing. Because there do have to be tweaks and shifts based on what the staffing is and what the facts are on the ground in terms of the profile of people who show up for health care. But I remember, just so you don't feel alone, many years ago, more than 15 years ago, my foundation was asked to help in retrofitting the Empire State Building, which was the oldest big building in the world ever to get any kind of certification from the LEEDS people, the Leadership in Environmental and Energy Design, because they cleared off a floor, hired 275 people to work full-time for 6 months, replaced the chillers, replaced the windows with more efficient glass, replaced all the on and off switches, thanks to Johnson Controls, and did a lot of other things with the insulation, and they did great, and they immediately cut the energy uses by 40%. And at the time, there were tax credits involved in New York, so they paid the bills off in 5 years instead of the projected 7.5, after which every tenant and the building owner split the 40% reduction in electric costs. And they were reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So a couple of years ago, I went back to the Empire State Building, this time with the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, and the head of the state's energy efficiency agency, who had sponsored Tony Malkin, who owns the building, and the Empire State Trust, a lot of other buildings. And he was, meanwhile, building 9 zero-emissions buildings, or 5 buildings, and 9 buildings, and 4 were zero emissions, and the others were very low emissions. And he said, we're going to cut this almost 100-year-old building's emissions another 40%. And we're going to put online how we do it, exactly how we do it. I don't want any competitive advantage for this. I want America to do this. You know, 2% of our land is taken up by urban areas, and they have 70% of the emissions, and it'll make us a healthier country, and it'll create lots of jobs. And he put it online, and I was there to hawk it because I had been there at the beginning. And it's stunning the number of people who still won't even read it because there's more than one moving part. And the more moving parts you have to solve a complex problem, the more people find some reason not to do something. And it's true even if you're talking about saving lives. So sometimes it's just policy denial. Like now, the biggest cause of death among young people are gunshot wounds. And people say, oh, that's terrible. Well, they allowed the assault weapons ban I passed and the 10-bullet ammunition clip limit I passed to expire. And now the gun owners think that it's a violation of the organizations, not the people, a violation of their constitutional rights if every 18-year-old kid in America can't buy an assault weapon van with a 30-bullet clip, the AR-15 with a 30-bullet clip. And it's crazy. So I think the biggest, what I would do if I were involved in this on a daily basis is to try to figure out how to accelerate replication and how to make people feel that they're not going to be shamed if they admit that they haven't been doing something that works. They'll be welcomed into the fold. Nelson Mandela was a genius at this. He was the best I ever saw, and because he had a lot of chits in the bank, you know, he could offer his blessings, and after all, he'd spent all that time in jail, but he never tried to make people feel bad for what they hadn't done. He tried to make people converts to what they could do. Early last year, one of my best friends, Dr. Paul Farmer, died at a hospital that I helped him build in Rwanda, where he had also put a medical school in. He was only 62 years old, but he came from a family with heart problems. His father died at 49. He had an aunt died at 53. And I wanted him to live to be 90. And soon as COVID permitted it, he flew to Africa and started treating patients again. He had 2 wonderful years at home with his wife and kids. And I talked him into going to Rwanda several years ago. And he said, how long do I have to stay? I said, about 6 months. And he stayed 7 years. And they had 2 more kids. But I read, he's written a dozen books about how poor people deserve the same quality of health care that people who aren't poor, and how to do it. And they're full of righteous anger, which he has earned the right to express. I mean, this guy was raised in a converted school bus that was turned into a giant RV with 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And his father was a traveling salesman, and his mother was a teacher who stopped to raise her kids, all 5 of them. And he went to Duke, he went to Harvard, he had a great job at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. But his passion was to keep bringing health care to the poor. But he was the happiest guy I ever saw. He was mad and happy at the same time. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. He said, what have I got to be mad about? I get to do the work I love, the things I believe, and say what I believe, and try to help save people's lives. So he said, all I have to do is make sure I don't keep my mouth shut when I should talk, and I do keep it shut when I should learn. And he taught me something that I learned in a different way as a child, which is that you need converts to do anything big. And telling people how bad they are is normally not a good way to convert them. I love to tell the story of my 8th grade science teacher who, to put it mildly, was not a handsome man. He wore Coke bottle glasses. He's a retired coach who had to teach a few more years to earn his full retirement. And he couldn't, Arkansas teachers were very poorly paid, so he couldn't afford new clothes as he got bigger and bigger. It's a problem that I and not other people, not young, sometimes experience, especially after COVID. And anyway, he chewed on a cheap cigar in a plastic holder, which gave his mouth a real pinched look. He was not a handsome man. And on the last day of class, 64 years ago, I remember this like it was yesterday, in this month, 64 years ago, he said, you're not going to remember anything you learned about 8th grade science, so you don't remember anything else. You remember this one thing. Every morning I get up and I go into the bathroom and I throw water in my face. I put the lather on my face and I shave and I wipe it off and pat my face down and I stare into that mirror and I say, Vernon, you are beautiful. He said, you remember that. Everybody wants to believe they're beautiful, that they have some piece to add to life's great puzzle. And if you remember that one thing, it'll take you a long way. I think that that's what you've got to do. We've got to get more zealous converts. I met at least 2 parents in the photo line who'd lost children to medical accidents. We need to use them and say, look, these people are not waiting in a dark corner trying to shoot somebody that was in the hospital on that fateful day. They're trying to make this a safer world for everybody to follow. And that's what our solemn obligation is. And we've got to do that. People need help to get out of denial. I met one father of one of the boys that was killed in Uvalde, Texas. Last year, right before the election, I went down to South Texas, and this guy was in deep South Texas, and the guy drove down from Uvalde to see me, and we were talking, and he said, how am I going to do this? I've got to do something. I can't let my kid have died in vain. And I said, ask for help. I said, just keep telling these people. I said, down deep inside, all that crazy macho denial, there's still a person somewhere, and you have to drag that person out. And I think that's what we've got to do. I mean, if you think of all the progress that's been made in the patient safety movement in the 10 years since I've been coming to your events, and we knew for more than a decade before that up to then 100,000 people a year were dying in the hospital from medical errors. It's stunning that there are any. I mean, you can't stop. People are human. They make mistakes. There are honest mistakes that will always be made. But systematic error should have been eradicated by now, given the level of data you have. So there will always be, the doctor who's still upset because of the fight he had with his or her wife and all that kind of stuff. But we haven't eradicated the systematic errors that the evidence has been telling us for years should be eradicated. And so if I were you, because this is an incredibly diverse group of people, I would be trying to figure out how I could create in every community and in every state in America a culture of conversion, of people who, believe that it's a stupid way to live, to be smug and think you know everything. And normally you're just hiding the fact that you're afraid you'll look bad if somebody else did something before you do. When I was a governor, I reminded my cabinet and staff over and over again that the founding fathers created state governments to be laboratories of democracy. And the only way they could be successful is if they found some big breakthrough on any issue in the laboratory, they would put it out to the rest of the people and they too would adopt it. And yet the longer you go on with any institution, the more resistance builds up to accepting the evidence and making the change. And the more people are afraid, well, what if I try and I don't get it done? I think that's a huge problem in America now. People just hunker down and they're like Vernon Doki. Somebody's telling them they're ugly all the time. And we've got to develop a culture of conversion. Nobody wants to see innocent people die. And very few people are hard-hearted enough not to care. So the real problem is we're not hardwired enough and disciplined enough to want to do what needs to be done. So I always told the people when I was a governor, I said, I will be prouder of us if we are the second state to do something than if we're the first. Never be afraid to copy somebody else who's doing the right thing. And I really feel that. I think that's the most important thing we can do.
Wow. When we had our first summit, we kicked it off with a story of another mom who lost her daughter to opioid overdose. And when we say overdose, we're not saying they took too much. They took what they were given. And it's so sad that 10 years later, today, we had two stories of two moms who lost their kids again to opioid overdose. One of them donating his kidney to his sister and was given so much drugs and was not being monitored. And we had one of our very, very well-respected anesthesiologists and researchers who's with another clinician, Susan McGrath, Dr. Black. They've done a 10-year study to show opioid-induced respiratory depression-related deaths should not happen anymore. It's one of those preventable errors that could be 100% solved. And it's like you say, attack the systemic. That's the stuff we have to do. And it's just so sad for me to sit here and have to meet another mom that's lost another child in a hospital. Now, we created solutions for those. I was sitting at a kitchen table with you several years ago where you knew that and you challenged me. You said, Joe, go do something for people at home. And I wasn't even aware of it. You made me aware. At the time, 50,000 people were dying of opioid overdose from either illicit use or prescription use. Last year, I think the number was more like nearly 100,000 and 16,000 from prescription use. And you said, go do something about it. And we did. We made something called Opioid Halo. We just got it FDA approved, de novo, about a month ago. And we're about to hopefully introduce it. And you made opioid one of your two primary targets of things you wanted to fix, opioid-related deaths. And you told me that, and you're still doing it. So where are we? I know you helped make Narcan available. You called the CEO of the company who made it, asked him to make it nasal so more people feel comfortable give it. I know you've donated so much of it, and you've saved a lot of lives, but where are we? What is the state of it, and what do we do to finally make sure nobody dies of opioid-induced respiratory death?
Well, first, apart probably beyond the scope of most of us at this conference, is that too many are ingested in the first place. And we need to make sure that the medical protocols are permanently updated to reduce the number of people that need them in the first place. Secondly, on the other end, we need to, improve the speed and effectiveness of our response. And I think, when you and I were together in Little Rock, where your pop-up lab and your warehouse is, I was impressed not just by your halo, but by the bridge, which you told me was based on a 2,000-year-old Iranian or Persian medical therapy, but it basically caused vibrations of the cranial nerves properly identified and selected for 15 minutes, which reduces by 85% the difficulty of withdrawal, which is amazing. So I think we have to keep doing that. Now, the reason the numbers are up brings me to the third question. There's during and in the aftermath of COVID, both the scope and effectiveness of law enforcement was strained. And I know it was in New York where we had a horrible COVID problem. And it was throughout the country. And the increase in the number of people who felt, for a variety of reasons, desperation was more rapid. And then more and more of it was laced with fentanyl, which is poisonous and for which we haven't got anything like the miraculous response we have for straight opioids. So all that has to be addressed. But we could do much better about it. There are life expectancies actually going down in America in a lot of demographic groups. And most of them are dying deaths of desperation. So that the opioids are the weapon, but the hand lunging at the gun is desperation. So I think we need to have fewer of them on the market. We need to find all the ways we can to reduce the number in the first place. I think we need to accelerate the availability and speed and delivery systems of the technologies that we know make it easier for people to walk away. And thirdly, we've got to deal with this delivery system problem. And it's very frustrating to me because we were getting, an enormous percentage of our fentanyl from China at one time. And now, it's a lab thing. So this is not easy, but it can be done. And I tell you this, I just was with my brother in Arkansas, who's 10 years younger than I am, and he's an addict. And he's been sober for 6.5 years, the longest period since he was 15 years old when he started smoking marijuana and drinking beer every day in school, during school. And I'm so proud of him, I don't know what to do. And but I know how hard it is. We went through 2 different recovery programs, and the only reason the second one worked, well, first of all, it was really good. It was effective and good, but ridiculously expensive if you're an ordinary person making an ordinary wage. And secondly, he nearly died. So in an attack, visiting a friend in Indiana, he came very close to death, and finally he had to look in the mirror and ask himself if he wanted to live. And there are so many people who play games with it who never have that chance. Some actually say, no, I don't, not enough to give this up. But I think that, we could talk till tomorrow morning about this, but I think we should start with those 3 facts. What can we do to reduce the legal prescription of something we know can kill you if you use too much of it? What can we do to build networks in every community of any size to distribute devices like Narcan and other things quickly enough to make a difference? And one of the things that you've done deals with the biggest problem with that, which is that once you go to sleep, you're alone. And Hillary and I have lost, we have 5 close friends whose children died from drug problems, and 4 of them just simply fell asleep and never woke up. And 2 of them were super smart. I mean, super smart. But they didn't know when they took a pill to get a buzz after drinking beer or wine or whatever, that it deadens the part of your brain that tells your body to breathe while you're sleeping. So I tried to convince, people laughed at me when I tried to do this in the federal government after I left. I tried to convince the federal government to have the education department issue guidelines so that a printed set of instructions and information would go home with every public school student in America at the beginning of every school year, and that they would have to give it to their parents. And they acted like I had said they all had to go to jail for the weekend. Like, oh, how can we do that? I said, how can you not do that? You think these kids are going to be happy that you didn't burden them when they have to grow up without a parent? But I don't think, again, this goes back to the patient safety movement. We know perfectly well that there are a lot of things like that that would work, that most loving parents who aren't yet fully addicted would never intentionally kill their kids. I mean, kill themselves and prevent their kids from having a parent. And we just don't do it. And so, you know, people like you could stay here till the cows come home, and people would still keep dying like flies if they don't do what they ought to know to do and what they ought to be able to access easily. So I always try, whenever we go into a country dealing with not just healthcare, but also how to save small farmers from being forced off the land in dirt-poor countries and then being driven into cities where they can't find jobs and they live in desperation, that kind of stuff. I always figure out how we can make this as user-friendly as possible. Make it hard for people not to do the right thing instead of easy for people to think about something else. It's amazing, and the more drugs you use, one of the things I know, I'm going through decades of this with my brother, is that your concentration capacity is zip. You know, you just can't keep it going. And my guilt, is all of us loving family members have our guilts. My guilt is how many times I was at a holiday dinner with him for years when he was much, much, much younger, and he'd get up from the table twice and go to the bathroom, and dumb me, I didn't even know what the deal was. But I think, anyway, that's my advice. I think if we got something we know works, we at least ought to make sure everybody knows. And I bet you today, not 15% of the high school and college students in America know that if you mix any amount of alcohol with an opioid and you fall asleep, you're at risk of death. These two kids that were unbelievable that I knew. And if it had happened to them in an outdoor cafe in, you know, a city where they're having lunch in the sunlight, they'd both be alive today. Somebody probably would have found them and, you know, got them Narcan or something. And I think about it all the time. So I may be wrong about it, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think that there's so many times that you can think of exceptions to every story I've told you. You don't have to save everybody, you just have to save everybody you can. And I think you got to have that attitude.
This morning, I had this strange conversation with my wife. I felt a bit like a loser. She said, "Can I have some money?" Before I could answer, she said, "Yeah, I want some money because you guys don't know at Massimo how to market products. Nobody knows about Bridge. And Bridge could save so many people's lives." I mean,
that Bridge thing is, you know, I wanted it because you had me convinced that it would keep me from ever falling into a funk. Yeah. I mean, I thought I'd be able to leap small buildings in a single bound.
Maybe.
But
can't already.
But when I talk to people about it, their eyes get big as dollars. And they all want one, people in this. So I think marketing is a big part of this.
Yeah, we got to do more. And I personally experienced it. I was telling this crowd about how I was avoiding opioids because I was afraid I'm going to get addicted to it when I was in a hospital. And at some point I needed it so bad that I took it, and boy, did that make me feel good. But soon I became resistant. I wanted it more, from every 6 hours to every 5 to every 4 maximum. And my team came, put Bridge on me, and literally within half an hour I was calm. I was able to get off of opioids entirely about a week before I discharged from the hospital. So no, I feel a sense of responsibility. We've got to do more. I appreciate your help and what you're doing. I know you've asked to set up a meeting with a bunch of hospitals in New York to introduce them to Bridge and Opioid Halo, and I'm just couldn't be more grateful to you. You know, I got a lot of hope and a lot of mojo from coming to your CGI, traveling with you to Africa, going to that hospital in the middle of nowhere in Rwanda where Paul Farmer had, with your help, built the cancer hospital. Remember, I made you all delayed as I gave him equipment before I could leave. I think of you as the commander in hope. What can you say to us to make us hopeful about the future?
Well, first of all, it would be arrogant of us to be despairing about all the negative things that are happening today as if it's never happened before. All this denial and this new movement for control of people and defining your importance in life by how much you can otherize people who are different from you, convincing other people that it's not important to make anything good happen, it's just important to control them, whoever they are, and keep them from doing something terrible, whatever that is. This is a very old story. It probably happened in prehistory. But I think, here's my best hope for you. I read a book a decade ago, almost. It was published in 2014, I think, called The Social Conquest of Earth by a man who died a couple years ago at 90 named E.O. Wilson, who was kind enough to befriend me, if you will. He thought I was a curious older man. And he died at 90. He was he's probably the world's most prominent insect biologist. He wrote a book which told me when I was president that the combined weight of all the ants on Earth outweighed the combined weight of all the people on Earth, which was quite eye-popping, especially since I just read last week that we may have underestimated the total number of ants by several hundred billion. So anyway, in this book, Wilson says that if you look at the whole history of life, all life, not just humans, on Earth, as far back as we have been able to determine it, what are the most successful species that have ever lived? Ever. And he said, I think the answer is ants, termites, bees, and people. If the definition of successful is the ability to avoid repeated opportunities to be wiped out. And he said it's difficult to make conclusions about the dinosaurs who ruled the earth for a very long time, probably 100 million years, and were wiped out by a cataclysmic climate event caused by a meteor that struck the Yucatan 66 million years ago. But he said, ants, termites, bees, and people have one thing in common. They are extraordinary cooperators. And we talked about a species of ants that, if running from predators in huge numbers across grassy plains in Africa, would find a big sprig of grass and a whole bunch of ants would just run up there and sacrifice themselves and let the predators devour them to slow them up while the others got away. He talked about termites, which we know there are more of. There's new press on that, who dug underground housing with 5 big holes that looked like entryways, but they would only go in and out of one because the other 4 were used for air conditioning. And he talked about their uncanny sensitivity to oncoming weather events, which could drown them if they were down in there. And they wouldn't go underground at all. They'd sleep outside if they had to until whatever it was that was telling them this was dangerous happened. And bees are great coordinators, and he talked about how complicated they were. I know what I read. What I read about termites that I liked as a man is that all bee colonies are ruled by women. And it's only the termites, by contrast, rule with a man, even if it's often the case he doesn't get to do as much as work as the women do. But they at least have the image of dominance of a royal couple. So the point is, he said, they did. He said, there are thousands of spiders on Earth, and that they're almost always have been solitary creatures. But there are 24 species of spiders that have been documented by those who study such things over the last 2 generations. And once they started cooperating, they have doubled their life expectancy, doubled their strength, doubled their caloric intake, doubled everything, because they're working together. And their webs are much harder to break. He said, now people are the best of all, but the most perplexing. They're the smartest because they have both consciousness, which as far as we know, ants, termites, and bees don't have. They're bred over time to these habits. And they have a conscience, which many animals do, really, but not to the extent people do. He said the real problem with people is they're so arrogant. They think they can break all the rules that they've set up and still get out of it all. So they push themselves to the very brink of destruction, and then they pull themselves back in the nick of time. And so he said, I spent my whole life, he said, sounding like a Cassandra, because species are disappearing from planet Earth at the most rapid rate, and at least 80,000 years, maybe more. But the truth is, I'm pretty optimistic because this has been happening for a long, long time. For at least 3 million years with we and our pre-human ancestors. So we're in a pickle right now because we have forgotten that cooperation beats conflict. We have forgotten that what we have in common is more important than our interesting differences. And the interesting thing is, a lot of our progress comes from our differences. Right? I mean, I could not be a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. I could never have unraveled the mysteries of the human genome. I could never have built that telescope that will see so far into the outer reaches of space that we have picked up signals that may be coming from as far as 13.8 billion light years away, when the whole universe is only 14 billion years old. I couldn't do that stuff. And most of you couldn't either. So that's really the question. And that's why you don't want to call people you disagree with ugly. Because you have to find a way to convert. And you can never stop learning. You can never stop adapting. And you can never stop trying to convert. Does that mean you shouldn't fight with people at election time? Heck no. Does that mean you should let people stamp all over you and mistreat your family? No. Does that mean you should let innocent people be treated like dirt and never say or do anything? No. But it does mean that you have to keep in the back of your mind that what has brought us this far is astonishing abilities to get together. one of my favorite doctors is David Feigenbaum at the University of Pennsylvania, who had Castleman's disease, a very rare form of cancer. And he was a college football player and a star in medical school and seemed headed for the stars. And all of a sudden, he is felled by Castleman's, given the steroid treatment that was available at the time, gained a huge amount of weight and could probably barely walk across the room. And he finally decided that, because like 30 million other Americans, he was victimized by what's called orphan diseases that have so few individual sufferers, they don't get enough research money. So he decided that given what we now know about the human genome, it was highly likely that there were drugs already approved by the FDA for other things that would allow him to live a few more years. And he set off on this merry journey. And he found one, and he started losing weight, and he was fine for a year or so. Then he relapsed. So he found another, and he fine for another year or so. Then he found a third, and he damn near died within a month. It didn't work, and he was about to give up, and he found a fourth, and that was years ago. And as far as he knows, he's completely cured. So he's spending his life trying to amass a privacy-protected database of the genomic profiles of as many people with these kinds of diseases as possible, and then coming up with an analytic app that will identify all the drugs presently available that have been approved that might have any application of what they've got. And they've already got documented people's lives they've saved. So that's a lot of cooperation. And we're not sure that everybody still follows the sanitation guidelines in every health institution, are we? So I think conversion and cooperation should be our strategy. And then all of you are smart enough to know what we're not doing and still need to do. You should keep doing that. But the idea that people would die while receiving health care because of mistakes in the way they get it, at a time when everybody, most of the people in all these institutions where this happens made a decision to spend their lives trying to save lives. So most of them are not trying to do it. And I think it's worth just about anything we can do to get people to get over the arrogance, defensiveness, fear, whatever, of not doing what we know works now. That's the most important thing right now, I think. We know enough now to cut the current problem in half or more. Second most important thing is to figure out ways to get more converts and cooperation in taking next steps. And I think it's a lot of fun, but it doesn't get as many clicks and retweets. And so it will probably never get as much press. I remember, but look, everything in life's like this. I remember the way they treated Hillary like a common crook when she was using her personal email as Secretary of State. And all of a sudden the press decides the most important issue since the end of the Vietnam War, the very next day, after the very first story ran, a former reporter for the New York Times wrote an online article in Time magazine, the online version, and said, this is a phony story. I used to work there, and I hate to call them out, but this is phony. And he said they cited a regulation which did say that most government employees should right now be using their official government email devices to send emails. And he deliberately left out the second part of the sentence, which said, but for practical reasons, there is an exemption for the Secretary of State and other senior diplomatic officials. In other words, they knew, the people that were doing this, the very next day, that it was a lie. And yet, every television network ignored it. Everybody, we're not just talking about, Fox News. I mean, everybody overlooked it. Why? Because there were rich gains in clicks and retweets. And you felt powerful. And there's a struggle. We're all like old India in a way, when the caste system held total sway. Everybody wants to be in the priestly caste. And in order to be in the priestly class, you have to be able to, without accountability, demean others. It's a terrible way to run a railroad. Also, you make stupid decisions. You wound up running into blind alleys and beating your head against brick walls. So I think you should all think about that. But first, get people to do what works now. I mean, I think even when I go to a lot of meetings like this, and I love them, and I just stuff my head full of stuff I don't know. And there's still a lot of storage space, and there's a lot of stuff I don't know. But I'm always amazed at how little attention is paid to the painful difficulty in societies, free and authoritarian, getting people to willfully embrace and eagerly search for things that we know work and doing it. So that's the first thing. That's more important than the other stuff, if you're trying to save somebody's life right now. I still can't figure out why the education department didn't want to give all these kids a little card that describes how opioids work and kill you and take it home to mom and dad. Yeah. But, I'm probably too simplistic to be right, but I think that's right. And the otherwise, don't forget, you have all the political fights you want, but in the end, your differences help you because you're cooperating, not because you're fighting. Because somebody's always better than you are at something. Somebody's always smarter than you are at something. Somebody's instincts or experience always gives them a different picture. So I recommend that approach. It's worked pretty well for me.
Well, when you began talking about all those things you couldn't do, I couldn't help but know that I know you funded two of them. You funded the Human Genome Project and the telescope that can see.
And the what?
And the telescope that can see so far away. So,
yeah, I went to the Keck telescope we did the work on the Hubble telescope and the others, and then this new one, the Watson one, I had nothing to do with. They started that after I left. But the biggest land-based American-funded telescope is the Keck telescope in Hawaii on Mauna Kea. And talk about an example of international cooperation. There are all these telescopes on top of that mountain.
Next to the
volcano. Any of you ever been there? Yeah. To the top of Mauna Kea? So there are lots of countries that have, and lots of consortiums that have them. But the two biggest ones that the Americans are in charge of, they're built by a coalition of NASA and various other interests, and they're huge. So I never forget, in 2018, Hillary and I, we asked if we could go look at it, and they said, sure, come on up. So we started it was in January, but we started at ground level, right, at sea level, and it was 88 degrees. And by the time we got to the top, it was 18. And Mauna Kea and Mauna Lani, they're both taller than Mount Everest. It's just most of them are underground. I mean, underwater. So they gave us warm coats, and we went to look through the telescopes. And I was looking into the Andromeda galaxy. And I was, scanning the Milky Way, and then we got to where Andromeda was, and you got to look into there. It was stunning. And then we came back down where the view of our nearer neighbors, like the stars around the moon and even most of the stars in the sky, is better at 9,500 feet for reasons that aren't worth going into. But I saw Orion, the hunter, for the first time in my life wearing what looked like a Worldwide Wrestling Championship belt. There were 3 rings of smaller stars wrapping Orion. So then we go and we're having a cup of coffee. And I said, and the guy that was running the American operation then, there's a new one now, God forbid was a German. I mean, they were from all over, but they were working for this American project. And I said, you guys ever argue about whether there's life on other planets? Oh, he said, all the time. I said, do you have big disagreements? He said, huge. I said, really? He says, huge. I said, what's the range? He said, there are those of us who think it's 85% likely and those who are convinced it's 95%. But he said, in a universe with not a billion planets, a billion galaxies, that is constantly expanding, that's still a big number. But he said, that's what we think. And I thought, first of all, makes you think it doesn't matter so much who's on Mount Rushmore and all of our various ego trips we take. And secondly, I thought, why in the hell? Let's assume these people, know what they're talking about. Whether they're right or wrong, why do we spend so much time worrying about things that don't amount to a hill of beans? And why don't we cherish the lives we have more, including the lives we lose too easily? I mean, that's basically why whenever I get disoriented and I can't figure out things or I get discouraged, I always think about what is the biggest thing I can think about, which today is the universe and all of its manifestations. What is the smallest thing I can think about, which for me, because I spent so much of your money on it, is the human genome and what it means for the future. Will there ever come a time when the social media will do way more good than bad? Is artificial intelligence really as scary as everybody says? Is it going to put a lot of people out of work? And if so, what are they going to do? If all they do is spend their time dumping on each other anonymously on social media, we're in big trouble. And there are things, that you should worry about. I remember I tried to be a paragon of openness. Hillary and I released 38 years of our tax returns. And at the time, the total for Bernie and Trump was 0. And so they reviewed them all, and they were bored because I didn't commit a crime, so it didn't count. Right? But I was at East Carolina University in 2016, and this kid he was a good-looking young guy. He had blonde hair and blue eyes. He obviously spent a lot of time pumping iron. He had lots of muscles. And he came up to me, he said, and he shook hands with me, I'll give him that. He was staring daggers at me. Lyndon Johnson said, if you meet somebody, you can't tell whether they're for or against you, you need to get in a different line of work. But this kid said, can I ask you something? I said, sure. He said, how did it feel to take $50 million out of your foundation? And I said, I don't know, because I put over $20 million into it, and I'm not worth $50 million or anything close. And Hillary's given 70% of her speech income to the foundation, and my daughter gives all of hers to it. So her husband does real well, and she just wants to pour it in. And so I don't know. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just get the tax returns. They're online. He said, yeah, you can do that when you control the establishment. And I thought, this kid has good muscles, but his brain's been fried. And I felt bad for him, because here he's got this wonderful world to think about, and all these real problems, including the heartbreak of parents in this room, to worry about, and things he could do with every waking hour of his day that he would feel better about himself for doing. And he's doing that. So I think that, anyway, work more on conversion and cooperation and doing what we already know to do. And it won't be as exciting as, and it may not get you as many articles for the meeting here as some breathtaking new answer. Sometimes there are some. I think this vibrating the cranial nerves so Joe can walk away from opioids is a pretty great thing. I've had serious injuries, I know, and I fought it till the end when I tore my 90% of my quadricep, because I was afraid if I had to sign the presidency over to Al Gore before and if I had gone on any narcotics powers under the rules I would have had to, then I would have had to read for 2 months that I was on death's door, when all I really needed was an operation. And we got to stop majoring in the minors. The most important thing you can do here is to remind people what the majors are. The majors are these heartbroken parents who lost their kids. The majors are the unbelievable things you can do without being a millionaire or without being the biggest or richest hospital in the world to save lives. The majors are the things that will have the biggest impact just because all the people are working together. So I am not pessimistic about the future, because nothing I have seen is something we hadn't been through before. Keep in mind, I grew up in the South in the 40s and 50s. And I remember when my mother, as a nurse anesthetist, before Medicare and Medicaid, when she had an uncommon number of people that she put to sleep, paid her in kind. And I was a kid. I liked that. Who the hell with the cash? One guy paid her was a fruit picker. And we had 3 different parts of the state that had peach orchards. And it was my favorite fruit. And when that sucker showed up with 5 bushels of peaches, I said, I hope, Mother, nobody ever pays you again except in fruit. We lived off that guy's peaches I don't know how long. So you've got to remember, life has always been a struggle. People have always wrestled with their demons. And people have always been under the illusion that exercising control over other people was the best way to live. And that we can't be trusted to make our own decisions and to make the right decisions and to be free and go together. This is a long story. Be upbeat and cooperate and convert. Cooperate and convert. And don't think doing something that you know works is not worth doing just because somebody else did it first. Being second or third is just fine, because those first people did not save the life that's standing there in front of you. there's a reason all these doctors have to go to medical school and learn all this stuff. What would you do? You worry about medical mistakes. What would you do if every doctor said, acted like voters? Really, I mean, madam, I would like to operate on your husband's brain in the proper way. But it has been done that way so long, I am totally bored by it, and I want to try an experiment. You'd go nuts, wouldn't you? That's the way we think all the time.
Yeah.
So just don't live an unexamined life.
Thank you.
And have a good time. Thank you.
I think we have something for you. Dr. Ramsey, are you coming? All right. You like that? Did you see my socks?
Even better.
The dinosaurs.
Yeah. I'm about to start a dinosaur exhibit at my library in Arkansas. And we did one earlier on insects. It was the most popular thing I ever did. Every kid wanted to come and see it. So we got big models outside and everything. So if you're into dinosaurs.
When are you going to start that exhibit?
It opens in about 3 weeks, I think.
Oh, sounds great. We got to come. We got to come.
Mr. President, we want to thank you so much for all the last 10 years you've been giving support to this foundation. And so we have these humanitarian awards that we give out to certain people. This one's called the Joe Kiani Award. So I'm going to give it to Joe to give to you, sir. Because,
oh, my gosh. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramsey.
And we thank you so much.
No one deserves it more than you. Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And now,
thank you.
We actually have another one. And this one, we've actually, without asking you, we've named it the President Clinton Award, Humanitarian Award. And we want you to award it to Joe for us for everything.
Am I supposed to give an award for my own event?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Wow.
If I weren't retired from politics, I would not do this. Because we would be accused of the worst case of self-dealing.
So, thank you. Thank you so much.
I love you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
You bet.